I jolted awake at the sound of furious banging against the wood. Outside my window, through a thin film of early morning fog, I spotted a figure standing in front of the small, colorfully painted cabinet by the community center, a cabinet I had set up to help feed local pets in need. It was shaking, jerking, and just as I was about to rush outside, a loud crack signaled its abrupt collapse. My stomach lurched in alarm. By the time I wheeled myself out the front door, I stood face to face with the last person I wanted to see this early on a Saturday morning. The neighborhood's self-proclaimed regulator, the HOA board member everyone secretly called Karen. She swiveled around at the noise of my footsteps, a pair of garden shears clenched in her manicured hands. Broken pieces of my lovingly decorated pet food station lay scattered at her feet. Bags of donated kibble spilled onto the pavement, cans rolled into the gutter, and the hand-painted sign, Ridgemore Pet Food Bank. Take what you need, leave what you can, lay splintered in the grass. Absolutely unacceptable, Karen shrilled, pointing the shears at me like a weapon. Her hair, styled in a pristine bob, bounced with indignation. This charity box is an open invitation for rats and roaches. We have rules in this community, and I'm afraid your little project doesn't meet them. If you think that's the worst of it, hold on tight and keep reading. You won't believe how far she's willing to go to sabotage a volunteer-run initiative that helps neighbors and their pets, and how that reckless destruction eventually comes back to haunt her in ways she never imagined. My name is Rebecca Henderson, a 32-year-old veterinary technician at our local animal shelter. I've lived in the Ridgemore Estate subdivision for 6 years now, drawn in by promises of quiet, tree-lined streets, and a sense of community. For the first 4 years, it was everything I'd hoped. Neighbors who looked after one another, kids riding bikes on the sidewalks, and holiday block parties that made me feel like I'd finally found a place to settle long-term. Then Karen joined the Homeowners Association board. Karen's arrival had been subtle at first, a few notes left in mailboxes reminding residents about minor rule infractions, always signed with her name and a flourish, Karen M., HOA board member. Next came the scolding emails about trash bins left out too long, followed by admonitions for holiday lights that overstayed the official permitted display window. Over time, she became the unofficial neighborhood enforcer, storming around with her ever-present clipboard, her stance rigid, her demeanor cold. People began to avoid her, or at least tried to. But if Karen caught you in her sights, there was no escape. I tried to stay off her radar for as long as possible. I kept my lawn immaculate and complied with the paint color restrictions for my front door. I even changed my porch light once because it was too bright for the vibe of the cul-de-sac. But it was only a matter of time before I, too, was targeted by her single-minded zeal for control. It all started innocently enough, with my passion for animals. Working at the local shelter, I saw firsthand how many families struggled to keep their pets fed. The cost of pet food can be overwhelming for people on a tight budget, especially during tough times. So, I approached the HOA, through official channels, as always, asking if I could place a small donation station in a corner of the community park or near the clubhouse. The idea was to have neighbors drop off spare cans or bags of pet food, and those who needed help could quietly pick up supplies. It would be discreet, respectful, and, most importantly, a lifeline for low-income pet owners in our subdivision. At that time, the HOA president was Mr. Sanders, a kind, pragmatic retiree who loved animals. He gave me a verbal go-ahead, provided I kept it tidy and labeled. We agreed it should be small and sturdy. I used leftover fence boards to build a boxy cabinet, painted it in cheerful colors, and added a slanted roof to protect the contents from rain. The shelter I worked for even sponsored some initial supplies. They were thrilled about the pilot program, hoping it might become a model for other neighborhoods. Everything went smoothly for about 6 months. Neighbors quietly deposited bags of kibble, treats, and even cat litter. Others took what they needed, always leaving a little thank you note or a small donation in return. It was proof that our community cared for one another's well-being, two-legged or four-legged. And then the winds of the HOA election changed. Karen rose to power in a small but vocal wave of supporters who believed the neighborhood needed stricter oversight. Within weeks, she'd begun her crusade, targeting anything that didn't match her view of a pristine suburban utopia. I suspected that my pet food bank would eventually appear on her list of unapproved structures, but I never imagined she'd go so far as to physically destroy it with her own 2 hands. I stared at Karen, my mind reeling. Pieces of splintered wood and scattered pet food told a story of utter disregard for anyone who relied on this station. My chest tightened with anger and heartbreak. "What on earth do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice cracking. She thrust her chin out. "Upholding community standards." She said it with such smug self-righteousness that it made my blood boil. "This donation box has never been HOA approved," she continued. "Plus, it's a health hazard. Food left in the open attracts pests. Mice, rats, you name it." My hands shook as I stooped to gather some of the scattered cans. "We have sealed containers," I argued. "I check them daily. There haven't been any pests." Karen cut me off. "Not good enough. I've received multiple complaints about roaches in the area and the stench of old dog food." I couldn't ignore it. I doubted that stench claim. The station was cleaned weekly, restocked frequently, and the only odor was fresh kibble. Neighbors who used it often left it neater than they found it. But there was no reasoning with Karen, especially when she'd already decided she was right. Around us, a few other residents emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some looked aghast at the destruction, while others wore expressions of weary acceptance, as if they'd seen Karen's rampages before. I wanted to shout, to accuse her of malicious vandalism. But I also knew Karen thrived on confrontation. She would happily twist any outburst from me into further justification for her actions. I took a slow, measured breath. The pet food bank was helping families. It was a project with the shelter's blessing. You had no right to tear it down without warning. She raised the shears again, almost theatrically. "I have every right to protect the interests of our community," she said, voice quivering with indignation. "This is my job. If you want to run a soup kitchen for animals, do it on your own property, under your own roof." My cheeks grew hot with anger. "Karen, you're on the HOA board, not a judge and jury. If you had concerns, you should have approached me directly. We could have discussed solutions. I bent to pick up a bright label from a can of cat food. Instead, you choose to destroy something that people genuinely need." She shrugged, showing not a shred of remorse. "I did what had to be done. And if you try putting it back, you'll find an HOA fine in your mailbox so fast it'll make your head spin." Tears pricked at my eyes, not just from anger, but from the heartbreak of seeing a lovingly built resource torn apart. As she stormed off, leaving me to gather the wreckage, I knew this was only the beginning of a bigger battle. Karen had declared war on my simple act of kindness, and I wasn't about to let her demolish it without a fight. I spent the rest of that morning picking up the smashed boards, collecting half-torn plastic bags, and retrieving cans from under shrubs. Neighbors came to help, some in pajamas, some stopping on their way to work. One elderly couple, the Delaney's, whispered heartfelt condolences. They'd been using the pet food bank for months to feed a stray cat colony near the creek. Another neighbor, Tiana, who had 3 rescue dogs of her own, offered to store the salvage supplies in her garage until we figured out what to do next. "What can we do to help?" Tiana asked gently as we carried boxes of kibble across the street to her driveway. The immediate answer was, I didn't know. I had a pounding headache. The morning sun felt scorching on my skin, and my mind reeled from Karen's brazen aggression. Beyond the physical destruction, I felt a deeper sense of betrayal, like the community I loved had a hidden darkness that allowed someone like her to run rampant. Finally, I shook my head. "Let me talk to the animal shelter first," I said. "They partially fund this project. Maybe they can help me figure out how to move forward within the rules." Tiana nodded and patted my shoulder. "We'll support you any way we can." By the afternoon, I was at the shelter, standing in the small break room where staff often gathered for quick lunches amid the bustle of barking dogs and meowing cats. My boss, Victoria Davenport, the shelter's director, listened intently as I described the morning's events. She was tall and imposing, but with a kindness in her brown eyes that had put me at ease since my first day on the job. When I finished, she sighed, leaning back against the table. "This is unbelievable. We sent that donation station with a label that said it was sponsored by the Riverside Animal Shelter, which is recognized in the county. The HOA board should have come to us if they had concerns. Karen claims it's a pest magnet," I muttered. "But that's never been an issue. I checked it daily." Victoria frowned. "We've done these pilot programs in other neighborhoods. Usually they flourish, or at worst, if there's a minor complaint, we address it amicably. I've never seen one get physically destroyed." She tapped her foot against the linoleum floor, clearly working through her next steps. I'll contact the HOA and ask for an explanation. If the station structure wasn't up to their standards, we could have built a more official-looking one, something sealed with a little glass door. Anything but this wanton destruction. She glanced at me. Don't worry, we're with you, Becky. We believe in what you're doing. I tried to smile, but frustration gnawed at me. Karen had shown how little she cared about diplomacy. Would she even respond to the shelter's outreach, or ignore them as she did me? Worse, I could imagine her doubling down, spouting more nonsense about pest infestation or noncompliance. But I also knew the shelter had deeper pockets and stronger connections than I did alone. If Karen wanted to make this a battle, perhaps the shelter's involvement would give me the backup I needed. Sure enough, within a day of contacting the HOA, Victoria received a curt email from Karen, on official HOA letterhead, no less. It read, "Dear Ms. Davenport, we appreciate your passion for animal welfare, but the structure placed in our community was neither permitted nor compliant with our guidelines. Ridgemore Estates takes sanitation seriously, and our residents have legitimate concerns about open-air food storage. Furthermore, your staff member, Ms. Henderson, failed to follow proper approval processes. Please refrain from placing any further donation boxes without our explicit written consent. Our board will consider the possibility of an alternative solution in the future, but no promises can be made at this time. Sincerely, Karen M. Ridgemore Estates HOA." The tone was formal and unyielding. Victoria forwarded it to me with a simple note. She's stubborn, but so are we. Around the same time, other cracks began to appear in Karen's narrative. Residents who had come to rely on the pet food bank started voicing their displeasure on the community's social media page. Some shared personal stories. A neighbor who'd recently lost her job and struggled to buy dog food. Another with a disabled cat needing special and expensive dietary care. An elderly man caring for multiple rescue dogs out of his pension. They were outraged that one person's unilateral decision had cut off a valuable resource. Of course, Karen posted right back in that forum, doubling down on her stance. I understand these stories, but we must protect our neighborhood from rodent infestations. This was done for the greater good. She then alleged that a child in the area had almost been bitten by a rat, though no one could verify that claim. The more she insisted, the more suspicious people became. For all the pushback Karen received, however, she seemed unmoved. If anything, her campaign of pest paranoia grew bolder. She patrolled the neighborhood, leaving notes on doorsteps if she saw any pet food bowls left outside. She cornered people walking their dogs, warning them about violations like having water dishes on front porches. The nerve. Meanwhile, the shelter tried a diplomatic approach, emailing the rest of the HOA board and requesting a meeting to discuss solutions. For days, there was silence. Then, at last, a group email arrived. The HOA board will meet next Tuesday at 7 p.m. to address pending community matters, including the unauthorized pet food station. The message was short but enough to set my heart racing. This would be the official showdown, a chance for me and the shelter to present our side, to show that the pet food bank was not only beneficial but necessary for many. But I also knew Karen would use the meeting to push her narrative of pest control. The outcome could shape whether we could ever rebuild the station, or if the project would be buried under HOA red tape for good. In the lead-up to that crucial Tuesday meeting, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Whispers passed along the sidewalks, at the park bench under the oak tree, and in the local coffee shop near the entrance to Ridgemore Estates. People asked if they could attend the board gathering, if they could speak on the matter. Typically, HOA board meetings were open to residents for a short, public comment segment, but seldom did more than a handful show up, mostly the same few folks who were deeply invested in property values and landscaping issues. This time, it promised to be different. The issue had caught the attention of not just pet owners, but also those fed up with Karen's overreach. And beyond that, many recognized that the pet food bank wasn't just about feeding cats and dogs, it was about community solidarity, about giving a helping hand without judgment. Encouraged by this groundswell, Tiana, the Delaney's, and I organized a small get-together at my home a few days before the meeting. We invited anyone who wished to discuss the next steps for saving the pet food bank. To my surprise, over 20 people showed up, sitting on my living room couch, kitchen stools, or even standing in the hallway because we'd run out of chairs. Among them were Mrs. Delaney, who'd been quietly feeding strays for years; Miguel, a single father of two who had recently adopted a Labrador after his kids begged for a pet; only to face financial strain when hours got cut at his job. Kayla, a college student living with her aunt, she rescued a turtle and a kitten, both reliant on specific dietary needs. Sam, a retiree who said the pet food bank was a symbol of neighbors helping neighbors. He didn't even own a pet, but believed in the project's value. We spoke about the upcoming HOA meeting, how each of us could voice support, and the importance of presenting factual evidence about pest control. Tiana suggested we gather receipts or photos showing the station's cleanliness. Someone else proposed collecting testimonies from those who had directly benefited from the donated pet food. A ripple of excitement passed through the group. It felt like we were forging a plan, not to confront Karen in a personal vendetta, but to demonstrate that the station's benefits far outweighed any perceived drawbacks. Just as the meeting was winding down, an older gentleman at the back cleared his throat. "I just want to say, we can't stoop to name-calling or personal attacks," he cautioned. "Karen thrives on that. She'll twist any anger into a reason to paint us as irresponsible or emotional. Let's be calm, factual, and united." A chorus of nods and murmurs of agreement followed. We all knew the precariousness of this fight. Karen was cunning and had the HOA rules at her fingertips, but we had numbers, passion, and hopefully a strong moral case that the board wouldn't ignore. The meeting ended on a hopeful note. People volunteered to bring printouts of data on how frequently the station was used and to address pest concerns with real examples. We parted ways, each resolved to speak up come Tuesday evening. On Tuesday at 6:45 p.m., the small parking lot outside the Ridgemore Estates Community Center was almost full. Cars lined the curb, and people streamed in, some looking tense, others resolute. I arrived with Victoria from the shelter, her briefcase stuffed with documents and photos. My palms were sweaty as we walked up the stairs to the community hall. Inside, the board's table was set up at the front, facing rows of folding chairs for residents. Karen sat at the center, flanked by 4 other board members, 3 men and 1 woman. They appeared somewhat taken aback by the crowd that had assembled. I counted at least 40 or 50 people, far more than the typical half-dozen who usually showed up to these proceedings. At precisely 7 p.m., Karen banged a small wooden gavel, calling the meeting to order. She read through a scripted agenda, breezing past the typical items about budget updates and landscaping contracts. Finally, she got to the bullet point that had everyone on the edge of their seats: discussion of unauthorized pet food donation structure and related community concerns. She cleared her throat. "Before we open the floor, let me state the board's position. The donation station was not approved. It potentially violates sanitary codes, and it was forcibly removed by me under the emergency provisions in the HOA bylaws." She paused, scanning the crowd. "We will now hear comments from relevant parties. Ms. Henderson, Ms. Davenport, you requested to address the board?" Victoria gave me a supportive nod. Together, we approached the microphone stand set up for public comment. I looked out across the sea of faces, some encouraging, some anxious. My heart pounded, but I reminded myself of the station's purpose. I began. "Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Henderson. I've lived here for 6 years and work as a vet tech at Riverside Animal Shelter. About 9 months ago, I set up a pet food bank in our community, with verbal permission from then-President Mr. Sanders." Karen cut in, her voice echoing through the microphone. "We have no record of that permission in writing, so it's essentially hearsay." I fought to remain calm. It was a standing arrangement. Regardless, for the last 6 months, the pet food bank has helped residents feed their pets during difficult times, job losses, medical bills, or just emergencies. There has been no documented pest problem. We use sealed containers, rotate supplies, and keep it tidy. If there were concerns, a conversation could have been had, but instead it was destroyed without warning. Victoria stepped forward next, introducing herself as the shelter director. She offered a stack of photos showing other neighborhoods that successfully hosted similar donation stations. She also showed an inspection from a local pest control company that rated the Ridgemore station as having low risk for infestation, especially with the sealed bins. As she spoke, murmurs spread through the room. Even one of the board members, Mr. Leland, leaned forward in interest, reviewing the documentation. Karen tapped her pen on the table. "Thank you, Ms. Davenport. We appreciate the visuals, but we have to prioritize the comfort and safety of our residents. I've received multiple complaints about the smell and potential rat sightings." Before Victoria could respond, a woman in the audience stood. It was Tiana, holding a folder of her own. With all due respect, Karen, many of us never saw these alleged complaints. I have a petition signed by over 50 residents who want the pet food bank reinstated. She walked forward and handed the folder to the board. Karen's eyes flickered with annoyance as she accepted it. Then Mrs. Delaney, the elderly neighbor, shakily raised her hand. The board allowed her to speak. She talked about feeding local strays, about how important it was to keep them healthy and not rummaging in trash cans. Another neighbor mentioned how the station saved him from surrendering his dog when he was temporarily out of work. Story after story poured out, heartfelt and genuine. I could see some board members softening, though Karen remained stony-faced, occasionally scribbling notes that felt more like a performance than real engagement. After nearly an hour of testimonies, Mr. Leland cleared his throat. Thank you all for your input. We'll deliberate and decide if the station can be reapproved with certain modifications. In the meantime, the board strongly advises no further structures without official sign-off. Karen interjected, a brittle smile on her lips. Yes, we'll consider it. But the board also holds the right to protect community aesthetics and sanitation. Let's not forget that. With that, the discussion was closed, and the meeting moved on to other items. My chest felt tight. Despite the outpouring of support, it remained unclear whether we'd convinced enough board members to override Karen's stance. She wielded a great deal of influence. If the board split, her tie-breaking power could doom the project. Still, as I glanced around, I saw neighbors exchanging optimistic smiles, offering thumbs-ups. We'd shown unity and reason. We'd put a human face to the issue. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. A few days after the board meeting, rumors flew that the vote was split. 2 members supported reinstating the pet food bank under stricter guidelines. 2 sided with Karen's push to ban it completely, and the last member was on the fence. The board had postponed the formal vote, presumably hoping to gather more information or waiting for the dust to settle. Karen, however, didn't let the matter rest. If anything, she intensified her campaign. She started emailing daily reminders about unauthorized structures, referencing rules about communal property and improper disposal of waste. She even posted signs around the neighborhood with giant red letters. Stop feeding pests. Do not leave food outside. One morning, Tiana called me in a panic, saying she found a typed note on her door, reading, "We see you storing large bags of dog food. Properly contain them or face a fine." It was signed with Karen's trademark flourish. But Tiana's dog food was kept inside her sealed garage. The intrusion felt borderline harassing. I, too, received a notice about my trash cans, claiming I left them out too long after pickup, which was untrue. It was the same pattern, any petty excuse to threaten fines, hoping to intimidate us into silence. Among the neighbors, frustration gave way to anger. Some started exploring ways to recall Karen from the board, though the process was complicated. Others wanted to rally in front of her house, but calmer voices reminded them that stooping to harassment wouldn't help our cause. Meanwhile, the shelter was also feeling the strain. Potential donors had heard about the fiasco and asked if it was true that local HOAs were shutting down charity efforts. Victoria tried to reassure them, but was growing concerned that the negative press might deter future sponsorship. The local news caught wind of the story, too, but it was overshadowed by bigger headlines, so we had no outside media pressure on our side, yet. The tension in Ridgemore Estates reached a fever pitch one Sunday when a small group of us decided to hold a supply drive in the park. We planned to collect pet food to help those in need, storing it in Tiana's garage until we could, hopefully, rebuild the station legally. We set up simple folding tables, a banner that said, "Pet Food Drive," neighbors helping neighbors, and some donation bins. Not 30 minutes into the event, Karen appeared, flanked by 2 other board members who looked uncomfortable. She marched straight to me, ignoring the families dropping off supplies. "This event was not approved," she hissed, voice loud enough for people nearby to hear. "You're using the community park for an unsanctioned fundraiser. That's a violation of Section 14.2 of the HOA guidelines." I tried to stay collected. "Karen, we're just collecting donations. There's no money involved, no large event. And this park is open to all residents. We're not blocking walkways or preventing anyone from using the space." Her glare was icy. "You're setting a precedent that anyone can come here, set up tables, and do as they please. This is exactly the chaos we try to avoid in a well-maintained community. Either pack this up immediately or you'll be fined. A wave of fear rippled through me. I was about to capitulate, but then Tiana stepped forward, arms folded. Show me exactly where it says we can't hold a small gathering in a public park. I've read the bylaws. As long as we're not playing amplified music or hosting over 50 people, we're allowed to gather. Karen spluttered, unable to produce the specific line on the spot. People around us had paused, watching the confrontation. A few murmured support for Tiana's stance. Karen shifted her gaze, suddenly aware of the dozen or more eyes on her. With a scoff, she turned on her heel and walked away, calling over her shoulder, "Fine. But don't be surprised when you receive a violation letter soon. The board does not look kindly on those who ignore process." An uneasy hush settled. Then, as if on cue, neighbors returned to chatting, continuing their donations. The standoff concluded, but the stress remained. Karen's intimidation tactics were wearing people down. Even if we won small battles, the war felt relentless. A week later, in the midst of Karen's intensifying campaign, something happened that no one saw coming. The local paper published an op-ed by a volunteer from Riverside Animal Shelter, criticizing the HOA's stance and praising the community for wanting to help those in need. It wasn't a front-page story, but a short piece in the Sunday edition. However, it sparked renewed interest. People in neighboring subdivisions started asking how they could support or replicate the donation station. Strangely, it was the negative publicity that might have softened the rest of the HOA board's position. Outwardly, Karen still displayed unwavering defiance, but behind the scenes, Mr. Leland and another board member, Ms. Rosen, began exchanging emails with me directly. They expressed regret over the incident with the station's destruction and confided that the board never held a formal vote to remove it. Karen had acted on her own emergency authority. They apologized, though somewhat meekly, and hinted that if we followed a new permit process, the station could potentially be reinstalled. This was the break we needed. Immediately, I contacted Victoria. We set about drafting a more formal proposal, a sealed cabinet with designated hours of operation and a lock to ensure no open food was left overnight. We offered monthly pest control checks, funded by the shelter. It was thorough, addressing every possible concern Karen could raise. We submitted the proposal to the board by email, copying all 5 members, not just Karen. For days, I waited, checking my phone obsessively. The tension was palpable. On a chilly Wednesday afternoon, I finally received a reply from Mr. Leland. "Ms. Henderson, thank you for your detailed proposal. After reviewing with Ms. Rosen and Mr. Blake, we find the measures satisfactory. We'd like to schedule a formal vote in a special meeting next Thursday. Please note that Karen M. opposes this initiative, citing concerns about pests, but we have enough board consensus to move forward with a vote. Kindly be prepared to present any last-minute clarifications. Regards, Scott Leland, HOA Board." My heart soared. We had a real chance to legitimize the pet food bank, to bring it back stronger than ever, and to do so officially. It wasn't a done deal yet, but we had at least 3 out of 5 board members on our side. Karen would likely be furious, but if the majority voted yes, she couldn't unilaterally veto it. That night, I barely slept, half excited, half terrified. The final meeting was set. This time, not a standard board session, but a special one for this specific agenda item. Everyone in the neighborhood knew about it. Folks were buzzing, predicting Karen's meltdown or further sabotage attempts. Little did we realize there was one more unexpected twist coming. The animal shelter decided to send an official representative with legal counsel in tow to ensure the discussion was fair. In other words, the stakes had skyrocketed. The Ridgemore Estates clubhouse was packed even more tightly than last time. Word had spread about the special meeting's purpose, to determine whether or not the pet food bank could legally return. Some residents arrived just to see if Karen would erupt. Others came to voice last-minute support or concerns. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. At precisely 7 p.m., the board members took their seats. Karen, in a crisp blazer, looked uncharacteristically tense. She scarcely glanced at the audience, focusing on her meticulously organized papers. Mr. Leland, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Blake, and the remaining 2 members sat with an air of subdued determination. It was as though they knew they were about to do something that might cause a permanent rift with Karen, but they were ready to proceed. The meeting began with formalities, then moved straight to the main issue. Ms. Rosen explained that the board had reviewed an official proposal from Riverside Animal Shelter and Ms. Henderson to establish a sealed, pest-resistant donation cabinet. She outlined the monthly pest control plan, locked compartments, and restricted hours. She then stated that a vote was needed to either approve or reject the plan. Karen took a sharp breath and leaned into her microphone. Before we vote, I'd like to present additional evidence of the rodent issues in our community. She then displayed a series of photographs on a projector screen, grainy images of alleged droppings, a trash can knocked over, and a distant shape that might have been a raccoon or cat. This is what can happen when we irresponsibly leave food out. We must remain vigilant. I felt a wave of exasperation. None of these pictures proved the pet food bank was the cause. But she hammered her point home, insisting that even with sealed compartments, the presence of constant food supply would eventually lure pests. The board allowed me, as well as the shelter's legal counsel, a composed woman named Lydia, to respond. Lydia calmly pointed out that rodent issues were more likely due to unsecured household trash or outside feeding bowls, not a locked donation cabinet. She cited city health codes supporting the position that sealed containers do not attract pests in any unusual way. Karen tried to interrupt, but Mr. Leland gently but firmly asked her to wait her turn. Flustered, she sat back, glaring. Ms. Rosen then opened the floor for brief community input. Several neighbors spoke, reaffirming the station's benefit and praising the new plan's thoroughness. Finally, Ms. Rosen stated, "Let's proceed with the board vote. All in favor of approving the pet food bank proposal, subject to monthly checks and compliance with the design specs. Raise your hands." Mr. Leland, Ms. Rosen, and Mr. Blake's hands shot up. A hush fell. 3 votes in favor. One of the other board members, Mr. Delgado, tentatively raised his hand as well. That made 4. Karen was the only one left. Her face was a mask of fury and disbelief. And those opposed? Ms. Rosen asked gently. Karen raised her hand. "I strongly oppose," she said stiffly. But it didn't matter. With 4 out of 5 votes, the measure passed. The room erupted in applause and exclamations of relief. People clapped me on the back, grinning widely. It felt like a weight had lifted off the entire neighborhood. Karen, meanwhile, gathered her papers in silence. She muttered something about grave mistake, and then abruptly left the table, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the calls of her colleagues. The aftermath was a swirl of excitement, everyone wanting to know next steps. When we'd rebuild, how soon the supply drive would resume, who would handle the pest checks. I couldn't stop smiling, and neither could Victoria or Tiana or any of the other neighbors who'd poured so much effort into this fight. We'd done it, legitimately, democratically, and with a clear majority. Yet, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Karen, humiliated as she was, might retaliate. Knowing her, she wouldn't let this go quietly. Sure enough, the very next morning, I woke to frantic phone calls and text messages. Something had happened overnight at the site we intended to rebuild for the new station. I threw on clothes, rushed out, and found a small group of neighbors huddled by the community center's lawn. There, on the grass, lay a newly delivered cabinet from the shelter, a sturdy, sealed design with a combination lock. It had been dropped off in the early hours by the shelter's truck, set to be installed that weekend. Now it was in pieces. Someone had hacked away at the wooden frame, broken the hinges, and scattered the screws around. The lock lay smashed on the sidewalk. A can of paint we planned to use was upended, splattering bright green across the grass. It looked like an act of deliberate vandalism. My heart plummeted. One question burned in everyone's minds. Had Karen done this? Or perhaps one of her fervent supporters? There was no proof, no security camera footage. And even if we suspected Karen, that was a serious accusation. Tiana stared at the wreckage, tears brimming in her eyes. "We just got approval," she whispered. "Why can't they just let it be?" I phoned Ms. Rosen, telling her the station had been vandalized. She was appalled and promised the board would investigate. Mr. Leland said they'd push to have security cameras installed near the area. But for now, the brand new cabinet was destroyed, meaning more delays in actually implementing the station. Anger welled up in me, but so did a steely resolve. "We'll rebuild again," I told the neighbors. We won't let this stop us. If anything, this proves how important it is to keep going. Somebody snapped photos to document the damage. Another volunteer called the local police to file a report. While the officer who arrived could do little more than note the incident and gather statements, it felt necessary to make it official. As the officer walked away, I glanced at the remnants. My hands balled into fists. I dreaded confronting Karen directly. What if she denied it, or demanded proof, or used it to paint us as troublemakers? But then, an idea occurred to me. The shelter's legal counsel had recommended we fully document any future obstruct. Ion. This was exactly the type of sabotage they'd warned might happen if Karen refused to accept the board's ruling. So we took exhaustive photos, saved them to multiple drives, and emailed them to the board. If Karen or anyone else tried to stand in the way of our second attempt, we'd have a clear record of harassment and vandalism. The policeman who came out did mention something that sparked a sliver of hope. Apparently, there was a doorbell camera across the street. The homeowner wasn't present at the moment, but if they had footage of whoever snuck in last night, it might solve the mystery. And sure enough, 2 days later, the homeowner graciously checked their doorbell camera. While it didn't capture the entire act, it did show a shadowy figure carrying a sharp tool near the installation site around 3 a.m. The figure was slender, wearing a hooded jacket, face turned away from the lens. Not an ironclad ID, but enough to suspect we had a malicious saboteur in our midst. As the days wore on, Karen became more isolated within the community. While we had no definitive proof she'd vandalized the second cabinet, rumors swirled. Neighbors who once deferred to her for fear of being targeted no longer gave her that power. Some demanded she step down from the board. A few even posted on the community forum asking if she'd pay for the destroyed cabinet, now that the board had approved it. Karen's responses were sporadic and defensive. She insisted that she hadn't touched the news station and that it was unfair and slanderous to blame her without evidence. Yet, her veneer of composure cracked. She posted lengthy rants about witch hunts and the dangerous precedent of allowing charity boxes to run amok. This only fueled more backlash. One afternoon, I ran into Mr. Blake at the local grocery store. He looked frazzled. After confirming no one was around to overhear, he whispered, "Karen's threatened to sue the board for defamation if we keep implying she vandalized the station. She's on a rampage in private emails." I sighed. Didn't think she'd go quietly. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Between you and me, the board is considering disciplinary action against her. She destroyed the first station without a vote, and now there's vandalism happening. We can't prove it's her, but the optics are terrible." It seemed Karen had overplayed her hand. The rest of the HOA board wanted to distance themselves from her. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to rally behind the pet food bank. Tiana raised funds through a small online campaign to replace the second cabinet. Within a week, we had enough money to build an even sturdier structure, this time with metal reinforcements and a more sophisticated lock. The shelter matched our funds, excited to see the community's resilience. The turning point came when the shelter's leadership decided to escalate matters. We received an email that the Director of Operations, Mr. Harlan, along with a representative from the county's Animal Services Department, planned to visit Ridgemore Estates to see the site of the pet food bank themselves. They also requested a meeting with the HOA board to discuss ongoing sabotage concerns and restitution for the damaged property, since it was purchased partly with shelter funds. When Ms. Rosen read the email at the next board gathering, Karen reportedly turned pale. It was one thing to butt heads with me, a single resident, or even endure some negative murmurs from neighbors. But facing a formal complaint from a recognized county entity was a whole different level of scrutiny. Nevertheless, Karen tried to spin it as government overreach. She posted on the community forum, warning that outside agencies should not meddle in private HOA business. That post backfired spectacularly. People pointed out that the HOA was subject to local laws and that the shelter had a right to protect its investments. The conversation quickly turned against her, with many residents urging the board to comply with any county inquiries. Thus, the date was set for Mr. Harlan's visit. Karen tried to get it rescheduled, claiming it was an inconvenient time. But Ms. Rosen politely told her the board majority agreed to meet then. I almost felt sorry for Karen, but I reminded myself how she had bulldozed my original station and possibly orchestrated further vandalism. This was simply the consequence of her own actions. On the appointed afternoon, a sleek SUV pulled up to the Ridgemore Estates Community Center. Out stepped Mr. Harlan, a stately man in his 40s with a courteous smile, followed by a county animal services representative, Ms. Castillo, who carried a briefcase. We gathered in the small boardroom, the same place where we'd had heated discussions before. This time, the tension was even more palpable. Karen sat rigidly at the far end of the table, arms crossed, trying to maintain an air of authority. The other board members, plus me, Victoria, and Tiana, were also present, forming a circle around the table. Mr. Harlan wasted no time. "Thank you for meeting with us today," he began. "We're here because Riverside Animal Shelter co-funded a community pet food bank that was approved by the majority of this HOA board. It was subsequently vandalized, causing financial loss. We also understand a prior station was destroyed, apparently without board consensus. We'd like clarity on how the HOA plans to address these incidents." Karen opened her mouth, but Ms. Rosen raised a hand. "Allow me," she said softly. She explained how the first station was removed under Karen's emergency authority, which was an overreach and not officially sanctioned by the board. She also recounted how the second station was vandalized and that an investigation was ongoing. Karen's face grew stonier with each word. Mr. Harlan nodded. "That's concerning. The shelter is prepared to file a formal claim to recoup the cost of the destroyed property, possibly from the HOA if it can't be resolved amicably. Additionally, Ms. Castillo from Animal Services has some points to add about the importance of accessible pet food in preventing stray abandonment." Ms. Castillo spoke next, outlining how community-based programs like the Pet Food Bank help reduce the number of stray animals, thereby reducing calls to animal control. She concluded with a pointed remark. "It seems counterproductive for a community to hamper an initiative that keeps pets properly fed and off the streets. We'd hate to see this become a larger issue involving local government bodies." The board members, except Karen, wore expressions of unease. They likely envisioned a legal quagmire or negative media coverage if they refused to cooperate. Karen stayed silent, but her eyes flickered with anger. Mr. Harlan then cleared his throat. "We'd also like to discuss restitution. The second station was brand new. Can we expect the HOA to cover the replacement cost? Or to conduct a thorough investigation to identify and hold the vandal accountable?" At that, Karen couldn't contain herself. "We don't have proof of who did it," she snapped. "Why should the HOA pay for a structure that, in my view, was never truly wanted by the entire community?" A hush fell. Ms. Castillo spoke quietly. "Because 4 out of 5 board members voted to approve it, Ms. Karen. That's a majority." Karen pressed her lips together, eyes darting from face to face, realizing how alone she was. Finally, Mr. Leland, in a firm but respectful tone, said, "The board, by majority, has agreed that the pet food bank is beneficial. We regret the vandalism. We will consider reimbursing the shelter and Ms. Henderson. However, we'd also like to see if the vandal can be identified." In that moment, something in Karen's demeanor cracked. She let out a frustrated sigh, rummaging through her papers. With trembling hands, she pulled out a typed document. "Fine," she spat. "If you all want to throw HOA funds at replacing this thing, I can't stop you. But you can't pin the sabotage on me. I had nothing to do with it." No one had directly accused her in this meeting, but her outburst drew suspicious looks. Ms. Castillo gave a polite half-smile. "We simply want the matter resolved. If the HOA covers the cost and the station is allowed to function with minimal interference, we can move forward." Ms. Rosen nodded. "That seems fair." Karen sank back, arms crossed again. The unspoken tension was thick. She was effectively cornered. After that meeting, the board convened behind closed doors, presumably to vote on the restitution issue. By day's end, they released a statement. The HOA would reimburse the shelter for the destroyed cabinet, paying from a discretionary fund, and they'd immediately purchase and install a new station as originally approved. They also agreed to increase neighborhood security measures. The statement stopped short of admitting Karen's wrongdoing in the first station's destruction, though it referenced an unfortunate miscommunication. But for us, it was a victory. The shelter got its money back, and we were free to proceed with a robust version of the pet food bank, with the board's official seal of approval. The next weekend, a group of volunteers, myself, Tiana, Sam, the Delaney's, and even Victoria, built the third iteration of the station. This time, it was a sleek, weatherproof cabinet with an easy-lock mechanism, labeled with the HOA's own insignia alongside the shelters. We placed pest repellent boxes nearby, as recommended, and installed a small camera facing the station. When we unveiled it on Sunday afternoon, a small crowd gathered. People cheered as we stocked it with brand-new bags of kibble and cans donated by generous neighbors. A sense of triumph and relief permeated the air. Karen was nowhere to be seen. A few days later, I heard from Ms. Rosen that the board had quietly censured Karen for her unilateral removal of the original station. She was stripped of her emergency authority and would no longer oversee common area structures, much to the neighborhood's collective relief. There was even talk of a petition to remove her from the board entirely, but that required a complex process. For now, we took solace in her diminished power. Meanwhile, the pet food bank thrived. Low-income families in the subdivision once again had a place to get free pet supplies, and the strays around the creek benefited too, as Mrs. Delaney continued her quiet caretaker role. The shelter was pleased to see the project reinstated, using it as a positive example in their promotional materials. Just when we thought things were settling, Karen made one last desperate move. An email arrived in the community's forum, purportedly from a lawyer representing Karen's private interests. It claimed defamation by those who had accused her of vandalism without evidence. The message demanded a public apology and threatened legal action if any resident continued to impugn Ms. Karen's character. The reaction was swift and harsh. Neighbors ridiculed the idea, pointing out that no one publicly named her as the vandal. People had only suspected her, and for good reason. She had physically torn down the first station. If anything, she was the one teetering on the edge of legal liability. Tiana posted a succinct reply. "We have nothing to apologize for. The evidence speaks for itself. Best wishes." The defamation threat fizzled. No lawsuits were filed. It was clearly a last-ditch attempt at intimidation. Meanwhile, the HOA's official stance was that the matter was resolved, and any ongoing disputes were personal, not board-related. From that point on, Karen showed her face less and less. She still resided in the neighborhood, but her once daily patrols vanished. Occasionally, we'd see her drive past in her sedan, scowling at the new station but not daring to act on her resentment. The rest of the community found a new equilibrium, free from her petty tyranny. In the months that followed, the pet food bank became a symbol of what Ridgemore Estates could be at its best. Families donated surplus pet items, local businesses chipped in occasionally, and the shelter continued its sponsorship, dropping off additional supplies whenever needed. The presence of the station didn't magically solve every neighbor's problem, but it did lighten the load for many, ensuring no pet went hungry because of financial hardship. For me personally, the station's success was a reminder that kindness could triumph over pettiness. After so much stress and heartbreak, seeing it stand proudly, sturdy, well-maintained, and stocked felt like closure. The sabotage, the fear, the bitter confrontations had all led to a final resolution that served the greater good. One late summer evening, I found myself at the station, refilling a few empty bins of cat food and noticing a note slipped into the suggestion box. It read, "Thank you for helping me feed my cat when I lost my job. I'm back on my feet now and hope to pay it forward soon. A grateful neighbor." Tears stung my eyes as I tucked the note away for safekeeping, a testament to the difference we'd made. Karen never apologized. She never admitted wrongdoing beyond that vague line of miscommunication. But the community saw through her veneer. Over time, her influence waned, and while she remained on the board in a diminished capacity, she no longer had the power to sabotage community initiatives. Sometimes, as I pass by her house on my evening walks with my dog, I see the curtains twitch, a fleeting silhouette behind the glass. I wonder if she regrets her actions, or if she still believes she was right about the pest invasion. Either way, it hardly matters. The station stands, people and pets are cared for, and the neighborhood stands more united than ever before. And that, I believe, is how true justice can manifest, through collective resolve, open hearts, and a refusal to let one person's callousness define an entire community.